Hey, so I wanted to make sure that I was just reviewing all the chapters, and that way we can go ahead and read chapter 10, 11, and 12 and take a quiz. Oh my gosh, my hair looks terrible today. Don't look. Okay, so here's the foreword. We find out about the author sort of being like haunted. That's a very strong word by Henrietta, but just feeling like Henrietta wanted her story to be told and that she was sort of like reaching out to Rebecca in a way where she wanted her to like research her life, even though Rebecca had her own things happening in her life. Henrietta wanted the decks cleared so that she could have her story told. And also, Henrietta's daughter, Deborah, supported this. In chapter one, we know that Henrietta was bleeding a lot after her fifth child, and she ends up like going to the hospital and being checked out. And it turns out she has cancer that was growing at a really terrible rate, according to like her chart after she had her fourth child. Then in chapter two, we find out about Henrietta's early life. Like she was born in this place called Clover. Her mom had 10 kids. When the mom died, the dad didn't like children, so sent him off to the grandpa. The grandpa was already raising kids by one of his daughters. And so she ends up like growing up with a bunch of cousins and brothers and sisters. And like two boys sort of loved Henrietta because she was really beautiful and attractive. And strong. One was called David, and they called him Day because that was her accent. And then the other guy who loved her was just passionately in love with her. His name was Crazy Joe and did all kinds of things to try to get her attention. But Henrietta's sister Gladys said that she did not think that Day would be a good husband. It turned out that there was a place called Turner Station that like was really popular because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the need for steel in World War II. So like it turned out like their friend Fred told them they should move to this place. And it was in, is it Baltimore? Yeah, so ends up like that the family ends up moving. We also find out like Henrietta had a daughter named Elsie that was like touched. We call that intellectually disabled. And we also find out that this Turner Station place was a really bad place to really work and live because there were toxic dust and asbestos and all kinds of stuff and lead poisoning, which ended up hurting the women and everything. So that could have caused her cancer. And like Day and her, like that's her cousin, they ended up having like 5 kids. And she had her first kid at like 14. And we find out in the next chapter, chapter 3, that she ended up having cancer, like cervical cancer. And a lot of doctors were researching this at the time. And there was a doctor called, it's a Greek name, we'll just call him Dr. Pap. He came up with the test called the Pap smear test, where you could like detect cells that were cancerous ahead of time. But unfortunately, they didn't know about it in Henrietta's time until like it's too late. But luckily, like that test was developed. We also find out that Johns Hopkins Hospital was the only place that treated African Americans. And there's a doctor there called Dr. Guy, and he had been working on like getting cells to grow outside of a body so that he could try to like cure cancer. And we also find out that Henrietta was like proud. She didn't want to tell her family about her cancer, so she was getting like treated on the sly. She was not aware that any of her treatments would make her not able to bear children. But like the tissues were sent to Dr. Guy, and there's no real record that they actually met. But we know that Dr. Guy tried to take her cells like another time. But after all the treatments, like the cells were just like too polluted and they died like everybody else's cells. And chapter 4, I call that big issues with a lot of tissues. In this chapter, it's just kind of like very suspenseful and talks about Dr. Guy's lab and how he came from humble roots too, and how a woman named Margaret worked in his lab that was like very fastidious, and she was very neat. And this tech, Mary, followed these rules and she found the cells, the HeLa cells, and they just kept growing. In chapter 5, we find out like the Elsie, Henrietta's daughter, had to go away to a home, and that just killed Henrietta. It was so sad. Henrietta finally ends up telling her cousins that she's sick because she ends up having to like go get more treatments. And it was far away from her house, so she had to stay at her cousin's house until her husband could come pick her up. It was a mess. Another thing we find out is that Henrietta ends up with some STDs from her husband. So turns out Henrietta's sister was right. Day was not a very good husband. Sad. In chapter 6, which you read without me, we find out there's this doctor who knew Henrietta's family but did not want to tell the author Rebecca about them until he was sure that this woman really did want to tell Henrietta's story. She was not trying to exploit the family anymore. The family had been exploited a lot. In fact, the African American community, if you could understand, they had just been exploited. The Johns Hopkins Hospital exploited them with just taking their tissues without telling them. This Tuskegee Institute study exploited Black people. They pay them, but the tests and everything is just horrible. Something out of Frankenstein. But finally, this gynecologist who knew Henrietta's family ends up giving her the phone number. In chapter 7, we find out George Guy is on TV talking about cells, but there's another insane doctor who ends up winning a Nobel Prize. He claimed he created a chicken heart, and he was able to do the first double bypass surgery. Okay, I'm not a scientist, but basically, I think the point of chapter 7 was that the whole cell culture thing was plagued with feelings that this was something that was racist, this was something that was creepy, out of Frankenstein, or it may be along Hitler's plans. So the idea of cell culture was seen in a very negative light. And then in chapter 8, we find out towards the end of her life, these tumors just kept growing within Henrietta, even though doctors kept claiming she was fine. They kind of misled her to think that she was going to be okay, but the cancer just kept spreading to the point where they were please don't bring your children to the hospital anymore. So the children would play outside of Henrietta's window to the point where she couldn't even get up out of bed and see them anymore. It was so sad. And then in chapter 9, oh my gosh, there's an epic quest for Rebecca Skloot to go find Henrietta's son. His name was David too, but he was called Sonny. And they end up it just is ridiculous. They take her to this place, and they take her to this place, and they show her a documentary. Then Sonny says that he won't meet up with her. I understand why they would not trust this white author. And their family had just been exploited and lied to, and they never got any money from herself. So the chapter ends with her planning to go to Clover. That's where Henrietta grew up when she was young. So that's where you ended without me.